we're giving you more powerful alternatives to some of Commander's most overplayed cards.
I'm Mia, and I like paying 0 mana for my spells.
I'm BZ. I like paying less than 3 mana for most instants. We're the Nitpicking Nerds, sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you want to know what cards we're personally into right now, they have them on the website, so just use the description, click the link that we have for you, go navigate there, buy the cards you want, and if you order for $50 or more, you get free shipping.
They have Bloomborough everything, whether you want precons or singles or sealed or a box or 10 boxes, they can get it right there. Also, Moxfield, because you're a liar and you know it. There's going to be an ad somewhere you can't guess. And that we have a Patreon. If you like the cats, which we really do, you should go check it out because it helps send them to college.
It does. It really is a great way to support the channel while seeing gameplay that we can't put on the main channel. And Dragon Shield has the best sleeves in the multiverse.
Good sleeves.
I want you to know about them, including their Spirit Animal sleeves, which I think go pretty hand in hand with Bloomborough's release. So head over to Dragon Shield, use the link, you use code
NERDS
at checkout, you actually save 5% of your hard-earned dollars. So what are we doing in this episode? This one's going to be fun, I think. We are going to be looking at Commander cards we feel are overplayed, which means see more play than we think they should. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're bad or unplayable, but we're going to be analyzing why they see play and then offering alternatives that we think are going to be more effective in general. We're going to be taking everything into account, and we will let you know exactly how we're analyzing a card when we get there. The one thing we do want to mention up front, because we don't want to just mention it every single time, so if you skip this and you comment about it, I'll link you to right here. This is budget. How does budget factor in? Because budget is definitely can be an influence for why a card sees play. It's because it's the cheapest option, or it's a cheap option under $1, whatever, very easy to acquire. We can't really tell when a card is being played because it's a budget card and when a card is being played because people think it's the best card for the scenario. So we're going to try to hit multiple price points every time we recommend cards so that you have options at every budget, but we're not going to mention budget every single time. We're going to cover this now, and then just know that we will recommend budget cards.
I just like to point out that we do a lot of budget builds ourselves. So the ones that are budget, like $1 and under, we want to say that they are us approved because we have played them a lot and we have had a lot of success with them in our decks. The first card that we want to talk about, because there are 10 total, are Unbreakable Formation. This isn't 7% of decks that it can be in, or 142,000. That's way more than I thought it would be. 2 and a white for an instant. Creatures you control gain indestructible until end of turn, but if you cast it during your main phase, you can put a 1/1 counter on each of those creatures, and they gain vigilance until end of turn. That is a lot of effects for 3 mana, so why is it played? You can usually do it for a couple reasons. One is to keep the 3 mana and have protection against board wipes, or you can use it offensively if you want to swing out and make your team a little bit bigger and also give them vigilance.
Yeah, this is one of the de facto ways to protect your team from board wipes, at least according to EDHREC, which is what we're using for all these stats. That's where the percentages and the number of decks comes from. EDHREC's a great resource. So this is mainly going to be used against protection against board wipes, and I don't know, maybe 10% of the time, maybe less. I say you will use it to like pump your team and get a free attack in. I think that's pretty rare. Feel free to let me know, Unbreakable Formation users, if you ever try to use it for that. But I think what this is mostly is cheap enough card that protects against board wipes. But of course, like with all these cards that we think are overplayed, there's some problems with them, and that leads us to not play them very often versus what the community seems to want.
One of the problems with it is that it doesn't protect against all board wipes. One of the board wipes that doesn't protect against is Toxic Deluge, which just got a reprint, and it is way down in price, so it is becoming more and more budget every day.
Right, I mean, we look at some of the best or most played board wipes in the format. I think of Cyclonic Rift, Toxic Deluge. I also think of Farewell. Personally, for me, Tragic Arrogance is up there. I know not everybody likes to play that card, so that's one for me personally. And then the next one's probably like Blasphemous Act. And I think even if you're going to save your team from a Blasphemous Act, you're like down mana on that exchange, and the person who casts Blasphemous Act can still like develop their board. So those all feel pretty awful, and those are the most played board wipes. So this doesn't save you against all of them. And I just think that like if you go through the trouble of holding up this mana and having this one card that basically you're never going to use offensively, you're probably going to use it defensively, you go through the mana, go through the trouble, hold up the mana, and then they play like Farewell, and you just look at this like, okay.
I mean, there are cards that just say like creatures have indestructible, and I wouldn't be playing those just as a static ability because I feel like so much nowadays gets around indestructible, so it's really easy to like kind of get around it. So because of that, I'm not sure if I would play a protection spell that seems to be thwarted, I guess, by a lot of board wipes out there. Another reason that we wouldn't really want to play that is 3 mana can be hard to hold up if you suspect a board wipe might happen. We mentioned that I feel like about 90% of cases that you'd play this is a defensive, not an offensive. So 3 mana to hold up for an instant speed, maybe and a destroy board wipe will happen, and they won't make me sacrifice, they won't make me exile, all of that.
No Massacre Girl or anything.
Yeah, that is just so conditional, and it's a lot to keep up for maybe scenarios.
Yeah, so a card that I think most people could agree is better than this, but it is a little bit more expensive to cast is, well, to buy. It's Flawless Maneuver. This is a 2 and a white. Your guys are indestructible, but if you have your commander, it's free to cast. This card has also underperformed for us. So I don't think it's just that we're paying 3 mana. Like, that is definitely a factor that I'm not super thrilled about. But when we even have been playing the free version, we're like, this is not a get out of jail free card. This is like 50% get out of jail free card. When you have to hold up no mana and nothing can go wrong for you and your opponents can't predict it, we still haven't been that thrilled with it. So I definitely want to talk about the alternatives because I think there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of different cards, and I think pretty much all of them I'd recommend across the board instead of Unbreakable Formation. The first one I want to go through really quick because it's kind of a no-brainer and it sees more play. Teferi's Protection. This is just a better card. I don't want to leave it off the list in case you didn't know, but this phases your stuff out, gives you protection from everything, blah, blah, blah. And I think what is critical about Teferi's Protection is that your creatures are not there. This card does protect you against every possible board wipe.
I mean, this is the perfect get out of jail free card, right? Your life total can't change. Your creatures aren't there. Your lands aren't there. Nothing is there. Everything just phases out, and you pretend like it doesn't exist, and you go, all right, guys, see you on my next turn.
Right.
So it's a really good get out of jail free card. But overall, it is a lot more money to pay, and I feel like one of the reasons that people are playing this is because of budget. So another way you can have a budget version of this is Eerie Interlude. You can exile things and bring them back on your side, so it gets around those destroy because they won't be there for a hot second.
Yeah, every other card on this list that we're going to list that we think is better than Unbreakable Formation also protects against every possible board wipe, so I think that's super notable. When we hold up this mana for stuff, I'm fine holding up an amount of mana. It doesn't have to be free. I'm fine holding up mana, but I want to protect against every board wipe. So Eerie Interlude is one of the examples of like, yeah, it can only save non-tokens. I think generally that's most of your stuff. And it brings them out. They're exiled for the whole turn. Then the board wipe hits, whatever. Then they come back at the end step. You're the first person on board, rebuilt fully, nothing happened to you. But you also get the bonus of re-triggering any ETBs that you had, which I think makes up for losing a couple tokens.
I think so too. The next one is Clever Concealment. This says any number of target non-land permanents you control phase out. And this is great. Even though it is a little bit more mana at 4 mana, it does have Convoke, so you can cast it for free if you really need to.
This card has been obscenely good. This is what I want, and this is what we're playing now instead of Flawless Maneuver. This protects you against everything, and it still has that if you've got a big enough board, which makes sense. If my board's worth protecting, I have creatures in play. So if all the boxes are checked and your opponents are going to want to play a board wipe, this is probably free, or you can set it up to be 1 mana or less, and it just saves you from everything. I think Teferi's Protection is a better card, but I think Clever Concealment is a better board wipe protection card. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I think it really depends on what you're using it for, right? Because Teferi's Protection, protection from everything. If you're worried about like Voltron decks or something like that, you might want to be playing that. Or if you care a little bit more about your life total, like that's the big deal. But if you're caring more about your board being wrecked, I might have to go with Clever Concealment. It's a really good card overall.
All right, so next we're going to get into some 4 mana cards. This is 1 more mana than Unbreakable Formation, but I think they come with that built-in protection that makes me so nervous to play Unbreakable Formation in the first place. It doesn't protect against everything. You're not unbreakable. This formation is very susceptible to a lot of... It's very bustable, yeah. So these cards are gonna give you protection, the thing you actually want out of a board wipe. I don't need the 10% offensive thing. If they have it, great, but I don't care. I want the protection the most. So Semester's End is one. It just exiles your non-tokens. It's the same thing as Eerie Interlude, but they come back with a +1/+1 counter. This is going to re-trigger ETBs. It's got okay synergy with counters cards, but it's going to protect you from the board wipes you actually don't want to just have run over your creatures. Oh, Massacre Worm hits, Massacre Girl hits, Toxic Deluge, we don't care. They're gone.
I also feel like there are so many ETBs stapled onto just creatures that you're playing in general. So not only is this save my board, put a 1/1 counter on them, it's probably at least trigger 1 or 2 ETBs that you have lying around, whether that's like go find a plains or, or put a 1/1 counter or, like fight this creature, whatever it really is. I think that this card will do a little bit more for you in the long run.
Yeah, next up is basically the same card. It's Lae'zel's Acrobatics, 4 mana. It flickers, it exiles your dudes. They return on the end step. But if you roll a high enough, you get to do it again. So that gives you 1 flicker that comes right away, and then they get flickered into the end step and come back. So this is just the same exact card as the other 2 times I've read this card. But if you have ETBs, this is even better because you have I think it's like 60-something% chance to just trigger them all, then bring them out, then trigger them all again, and that can be backbreaking. That can win you games.
I want to be seeing this at most in like Mr. House decks, because of the dice rolling abilities there. But I think this is a cool card overall. I think it's one of the ones that was slept on in Baldur's Gate. The next card that we have is Galadriel's Dismissal. I love this one because for 1 mana, you can phase something out. But with 4 mana, you can phase out an entire team of stuff, whether that's yours or offensively. If you'd like to phase out somebody else's and have everyone wail on them and kill them, it's an option. And I like the fact that you can play it offensively and defensively.
Yeah, this is great. This one has the offensive capabilities. And like we said about budget, I mean, I guess I'll touch on it real quick because the one point I wanted to mention is yes, Unbreakable Formation sees play because it's a budget card, but Teferi's Protection is a $35 card, and it's in a million more decks than this.
Oh, I didn't realize.
So it's hard to say what people are going for in terms of budget because everyone's playing this $35 card, and then less people are playing this 5-cent card. So I don't know where that stands. We're going to touch on it over the course of the video, but it is a weird kind of hard thing to judge. But I think Galadriel's Dismissal, while not being the most budget card, is perfect if you want the offense and the defense, because I can happily phase my own stuff out if you're going to wipe the board, and if I can get a lethal swing on you, oops, you have no creatures.
I've been dying to try this card out. I think it's going to play out way better than I thought, and I think it's going to play out pretty well already.
So let's get to the next one, and we're going to have some heavy hitters on this list. I think we're going to be starting some discourse with this video. We're going to go to a lot of mainstays in blue right now. We have Opt, which is currently in 10% of blue decks or 200,000 decks. That's blue for an instant. Scry 1, draw a card, but we have others. We also have Preordain at 12% or 240,000 decks. Blue for a sorcery, Scry 2, draw a card. And we have Ponder in 13% of blue decks, 280,000 blue decks. It's blue for a sorcery. Look at the top 3 cards in your library, then put them back in any order. You may shuffle, draw a card. So going forward, we're going to lump these 3 together. I think all of them can be taken individually, and you can look at alternatives as though they were any one of these, or pick one and then treat the following as an alternative to that one, whatever your least favorite one is. But these are very highly played cantrips. I think we just go into why people would want to play these particular cantrips.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of reasons. I mean, Beezy could probably think of a few himself because he loves Preordain so much. But one of them is it's just a cheap way to have cards replace themselves. It's like a filter type effect because it's whether it's scry a couple or put some back and then draw a card, it will replace itself, and it's only 1 mana for all of these.
Yep, in the early game, these are cards that help smooth out your draws. If I can look at 2 or 3 additional cards to find one of them, if I need to hit land drops or I need a removal spell, it's definitely good at that. And also puts a card into your graveyard, which is pretty relevant if you want to delve later, or you care about card types like Delirium, or you just want to have 20 cards in your graveyard for something that you're going to be cooking up. These do help with that, but I think there's problems with these 3 cantrips specifically, and I want to clarify that I do love Preordain, but I love it as a pet card. I actually don't play Preordain almost ever, and same with these other ones. I think there are many better cantrips, and I think these kind of, to me, don't really cantrip right. And I think the percentage points that you gain or lose from which specific cantrip you play, they're not as high as Unbreakable Formation not saving you from Farewell versus Galadriel's Dismissal saving you from Farewell. They're not that high. But why would I just play a worse card if I think there's better cards out there? So I still think it's relevant. I think this is going to come up. So the problem with these is I think they don't belong in every deck. And I think a lot of the 280,000 people playing Ponder are just throwing it in a deck where they don't have Spellslinger synergies. There's no cast triggers for when Ponder happens. It's just filler. And it just happens and it resolves, and then it just goes to the graveyard.
I want to see prowess triggers with my cantrips. I want to see all of my my spell masteries or magecraft, for instance. I don't think that just because I'm playing blue, I should be playing Ponder. And it just doesn't reduce variance as much as the 60 card formats because you have a lot more cards to get through. It doesn't matter if you can put 1 or 2 more on top or if you shuffle once. I still think that overall, I mean, that's still 90-something cards you're getting through if this is your first play of the game.
Yeah, it's so 4 Preordains in a 60-card deck, that really smooths your draws. They're all 1 mana. You're going to have them very consistently. But Preordain, Ponder, and Serum Visions in a 100-card deck, it's not like you're getting to the same cards every time. So I think you really need a way to pay off them in some way. It doesn't have to be that large. If you want to fill the graveyard, then maybe these cards are for you. But I think in some cases, people who are playing these cards, don't replace them with the cards we're about to list, because your deck might just not care about cantrips and you just want more impactful cards. Every deck does not need a bunch of cantrips. I would say reserve those for Spellslinger, graveyard filling, casting instant sorceries, etc., anything like that. So let's get the alternatives for the decks that still do want cantrips, but I think these are underperformers for me. First one, card's amazing. Gitaxian Probe. It's a Phyrexian blue mana, so it can be free. You pay 2 life, look at someone's hand, then draw a card. What is killer about this to me is so good is it is literally free. The difference between 1 and 0 is pretty huge when you're casting spells.
I think with Git Probe, in my mind, I always think of it as like a sweaty card because it can be free and it's like the turn 1 free play, but it is just a really good card overall. You're getting information instantly about the player you're most worried about. It replaces itself, and for 2 life, I mean, you're down to 38 life. You know somebody's opening hand if you play this turn 1. This is just a great piece of information, replacing itself and just putting it in your graveyard. I think I love this card.
Yeah, it is literally like air in your deck. There's no friction with you being able to cast this. It is always castable. You can always cycle it for 0 mana. Getting triggers off of your other things while saving mana on cantrips is huge. I think Gitaxian Probe is one of my number 1 go-to cantrips because it doesn't even require mana to cycle, and that is just in its own category. Next up, Consider. This is sort of my auto replacement for Opt. I'm never going to play Opt again in my entire life. I really am not. I'm going to maybe go to Consider. It surveils 1 and then draws a card. This now we're talking about putting 2 cards in your graveyard because of the surveil. That's generally what happens if it's not something you're in love with. I'm happy to bin it because now I'm feeling Delve, I'm feeling whatever, and I'm still getting the card out of it.
I really like the option of Surveil versus Scry because I think everyone realized how much more powerful the Surveil lands were when they came out in MKM versus the Scry temples, but I don't you can be making that same swap in your instants and sorceries instead, and I think that people should be doing that to make their decks run a little bit more smoothly.
Yeah, I think if you're playing Opt and you're not playing Consider, I think it's a really easy change for me. I would highly recommend it, and I would say it's basically strictly better. I really think you're never going to run into a situation where you're like, oh man, I wish I could have Scryed instead of Surveilled.
I think so too. The next one is Thought Scour. Target player, usually you, mills 2 cards, and then you draw a card. I play this in Uro, and it is absolutely great in there to be filling the graveyard and drawing the card and having 3 cards in the graveyard instantly.
Yeah, when you're playing a graveyard deck or an instant or sorcery heavy deck, you're going to have a lot of cards with flashback, a lot of creatures that you want access to, whatever the case may be. This puts 3 cards in your graveyard. Like, you're really churning through. I can flip an 8-drop into the graveyard now and then try to reanimate it later. This card is really strong. And added bonus of target player, even though you're going to hit yourself 95% of the time, you can screw up somebody's Worldly Tutor. That's definitely happened with us. It's like, oh, you want something on top? It's like you scry to the top and you need a board wipe. Mill it.
It really is. Mental Note is the same way. It's going to be you putting those 2 in the graveyard, I mean, most of the time, but you're going to be drawing a card off of it too, and just in general, having those 3 cards in the graveyard will help you in the long run because you're going to be playing it in decks that you really want your graveyard to be filled in.
Yeah, it's great alongside cards like Mizzix's Mastery, Treasure Cruise, all of these things. If you're playing any of these cards and they sound familiar, cut all of the cantrips that we mentioned in the beginning because they're not going to help you as much as these are. They fill your graveyard. The only thing about Mental Note versus Thought Scour is Mental Note has to mill you. Fine, they're the same card. Play both of them, be super happy about it, and definitely take this chance to upgrade your cantrips because I think it does start to add up over time when you cast them over and over, game after game.
The next card is Infernal Grasp. This is an 8% of decks, or 168,000. 1 in a black for an instant. Destroy target creature, you lose 2 life. This is very simple. This is great for 2 mana, and it's instant speed too, which makes it a go-to in a lot of decks.
Yep, it destroys any creature, which is what people are looking for when they're trying to put this card in their deck. It doesn't have a restriction on it. It's just like 2 mana, destroy a thing. It's instant speed, which is what we're looking for in interaction. 2 mana is not prohibitively expensive. I don't feel too bad firing off a 1-for-1 for 2 mana. I think once it starts to be 3 mana, what I want is to be able to target like any permanent for having to spend an extra mana.
Or multiple creatures.
Yeah, but at 2, it's like, okay, I can see killing one thing, specializing at 2 mana. It's also better than every other 2 mana kill spell in black. We're talking like Doomblade, Go for the Throat. So I guess this is like a sub-category of this section. If you're playing Doomblade or Go for the Throat, and you don't want to listen to the advice that we have later, at least cut those cards for Infernal Grasp and never look back, because that's great. But we think Infernal Grasp can still be improved upon, and even though I will say it's a good card, I don't think it's a bad card, we just don't play it.
No, we don't. I think that with the abundance of cards that are being reprinted and printed nowadays, there are a lot of cards that are better that are cheaper because of their reprints in commander decks or just in sets in general, or new cards that come out that are just as powerful, if not more so, because they can slot into decks easier. I think one of the alternatives that we talk about is Snuff Out. This was reprinted in Doctor Who and it made the price go down a little bit, but you can, if you control a swamp, you can kill something for free and you lose 4 life, and that's a lot better because you don't have to hold up that 2 mana.
What I care more about for in terms of cheaper is cheaper to cast. 2 mana is like okay, I mentioned, but the black spells that you're competing against, like this one does it for free. It puts a little bit of a caveat. You can only hit 80% of all creatures instead of 100% of all creatures, and it does cost 2 extra life, but you're saving 2 mana. You can hold it up at all times no matter what. Opponents are not going to be able to play around it as well because it's, how are you supposed to know when I have Snuff Out in my hand versus when I don't?
Yeah, I think that with kill spells, you need the element of surprise, and if you're keeping up that 2 mana, I feel like people might know. The next one is Lethal Scheme and maybe Pylon, depending on what your deck wants to do. These both have Convoke, which means you can hold it up for free. We love the free counter spells in here, and they will destroy something, and you can either Surveil or Connive, depending on which one you're talking about. And just overall, these have also been reprinted, I'm going to say kind of into the ground, because I think they were reprinted in recent pre-con decks.
Lethal Scheme is definitely my preferred of these two. I think Pylon is maybe more of a budget card, but Lethal Scheme kind of feels unfair when you get to resolve it. The more creatures you have out, the freer it is. And then also the more upside you get from the card. When you get to full cast it for free, you're convoking 4 creatures. Then you get to draw a card and discard a card 4 times. And also, if any of those cards were not lands, you're putting +1/+1 counters on the creatures that convoked it. This card is unreal. I think it's also, like even if you want to just compare it to Infernal Grasp in terms of, like, I'm probably spending 2 mana, black decks tend to have a lot of creatures in them. Certainly at least half of black decks are filled to the brim with creatures. So if you have even 2, you're getting the same rate as an Infernal Grasp, but you get to draw 2, discard 2, and throw some counters on.
I'd also like to point out that when you have black decks with creatures in them, a lot of the creatures are very disposable. So with extra counters on them, you could just throw them at opponents and they have to deal with whether they have to block with like a real creature or take extra damage overall. That can just turn the tides for you in the long run because you're just chipping in with extra damage.
Yep. Next, we're going to look at a card that is more mana to cast, but has better math if you divide. We have Curtain's Call, which is 6 mana, but actually it's 3 mana because you're going to have 3 opponents, and it just destroys 2 creatures for 2 and a black. This is 1.5 mana per creature destroyed instead of 2 mana per creature destroyed with Infernal Grasp. I also think Curtain's Call is better. I do love this card. It is pretty efficient, and when I start paying more mana beyond 2, I need something extra. This just says, here you go. Here's basically a second copy of a murder.
We just love the multiple target kill spells in general, and I think that this is such a good use of it. I mean, Curtain's Call is easy to slot in anywhere, and being able to destroy 2 things, I feel like sometimes people feel a little less bad if it's not just their thing getting targeted, but sometimes it's both of their things getting targeted, and it's better for you.
I definitely had people, who are more used to playing against like Murder and Hero's Downfall, and I've definitely played in games where I throw down a Curtain's Call, and they're just like, what does that do? I'm like, 3 mana killed 2 things, and they're like, oh, I should probably get one of those. It's like, yeah, you definitely should. Next up, we have 2 cards that cost 4 mana. However, I still consider them competition with Infernal Grasp. We have Haggard Mauling and Fell the Profane. These are not better rates. They are worse rates, in fact. They are 4 mana, instant speed, kill a thing. However, they are 10 times easier to include in your deck because they are oftentimes taking the slot of a land. I love a good MDFC. I had to at least get 1, or in this case 2, into this video. But yeah, I do still count these as competition for Infernal Grasp, and I think if you haven't put either Infernal Grasp or Haggard Mauling in your deck yet, the MDFC wins every time.
I think so too. We love MDFCs here, and they're just very easy to include. I mean, don't really include these in your 4 or 5 color decks, but you can easily slot this in as a land in your 3, 2, and 1 colors.
All right, next up, a card. I have like a mini little vendetta against. Thrill of Possibility is our next card. It's in 11% of red decks, which is 223,000 decks. It is 1 in red for an instant. As additional cost to cast the spell, discard a card, and then you draw 2 cards. Very simple. Why is it played? We'll just get right into that. So red card draw, it's terrible. And I would almost wager a statement of it's non-existent. So when you are in a mono red deck and you're trying to draw cards, that is very, very difficult for you. So I understand that. This does say draw cards on it. This puts a card into the graveyard. If you are trying to reanimate, people play this to discard some kind of big artifact or some kind of big creature to maybe get it back with like a Feldon of the Third Path or something. So also just real quick, when people play Tormenting Voice, if you are playing Tormenting Voice and you are not in mono red exactly, please cut it for any card draw in any other color. I think most of what we're talking about here is going to be restricted to mono red, so I just want to get that out of the way. It is a one-time discard outlet, so it does trigger Madness if you discard a Madness card. And the last thing, which I think is the most important part of why this card sees so much play, is it feels like card advantage. It feels like when you pitch one card and draw two that you are now up cards. But the first problem with Tormenting Voice Thrill Possibility is you are not up cards. It is not card advantage at all.
When you talk about card draw, you want to talk about how many cards you are up in the net. And when you spend a card and then also discard a card, you are down 2. So when you draw 2, you are net 0. I know this, I know people don't like to hear that because they really like this card, and I know they don't like it when BZ posts polls about it on YouTube community. But this is not card draw because you are not up cards in the long run. And it's just not an efficient rate in general. This is 2 mana, and it's basically a filter. It's like spend a card, get rid of a card, draw 2. I think the word draw really gets people. I think if it said exile, they'd play this a little bit less.
I really think there's not much reason to play this card, at least over the alternatives that we're going to list. We're going to list a few of them that are draw discard outlets because that's a reason people play this, and we're going to list a few that are just red card draw. So figure out what your decks need first, then come at this with only that section in mind, because when I recommend a looter and you're actually looking for card draw, just don't listen to that. We're gonna get both. First thing, Faithless Looting. This is a card that sees more play, so I don't want to spend a ton of time on it. But I think if your deck specifically wants to discard a bunch of stuff, Faithless Looting 1,000 times better.
I think so too. I mean, if you have flashback, it can really do a lot for your deck. The next card is Demand Answers. It's also 1 in a red, but you can either sacrifice an artifact or discard a card to draw 2. I like the fact that this is just a strictly better card because you have the option to sack an artifact if you have a clue token hanging around or just some little paltry artifact, or if you want to sacrifice artifacts anyways because of things like Marionette Apprentice or Marionette Master. I like the fact that you have options.
In a lot of those artifact reanimator decks, which I think red tends to have a decent amount of, this is strictly better. So I guess if you missed MKM, please take out Tormenting Voice take out Thrill Possibility, and I guess Tormenting Voice too. For Demand Answers, it is just better in every way. There's nothing wrong with it. It is only upside for you. The fact that you can turn this into actual card advantage by sacrificing like a Mirror Retriever or an Ornithopter or whatever nonsense you have laying around, that makes it much more appealing, because now we're talking about something you had a very low investment in. Sacrificing that on board to get cards, that can be card advantage, and that's pretty sweet. We also have Seasoned Pyromancer. It discards 2 and then draws 2. So this is not card advantage either, except it could be. If you have no cards in hand or 1 card in hand, you still discard first, and then you just draw 2. So you'll be up 2 cards if that's the case, but this puts a lot of cards in your graveyard, and it even has an ability from the graveyard to make some tokens.
The CZ Peasy has had my back, honestly. It's 3 mana, and if you can like flicker it in some way, I don't think you really can, but if you can get that effect multiple times. And I have had 0 cards in my hand a lot, and then he's just like, hey, he's helped me draw a couple cards. I appreciate that.
Yeah, next up is Party Thrasher. So this is a repeatable discard outlet. So your non-creature spells you cast from exile have Convoke, and in the first main phase you can discard a card. If you do, exile the top 2, choose one of them, and you can play that card. So we're repeatedly doing this. We're hitting our land drops with it. Over the course of the game, we're just going to get a lot of selection, and it's so much better, and it's actually the same mana investment as Thrill Possibility. Stays in play. It even has 4 toughness for whatever reason, and so it can block okay in the early game. This card just kind of does a lot.
I think just having the also line non-creature spells from exile have Convoke is pretty interesting too, because if you're in mono red, a lot of the stuff that you have card draw is going to be exiling from the top anyways, so that can really help you save on mana in the long run.
Next card is also from MH3. It's Glimpse the Impossible. You get 3 cards impulse drawn for the turn, and if you don't cast them for whatever reason, you get to turn them into 0/1s. So this can be like, this is basically budget Jessica's Will. I don't really know how else to put it, but I think this goes in essentially every single mono red deck that's ever existed, because it just draws you, it actually puts you up cards, especially the later in the game you are. If you can get 1 card off of it to replace itself, it still gives you 2 bodies, 2 mana for the next turn to ramp into it. It's just great.
There's just so many options, whether you use the Scions for mana, or if you have something like Perforos where you're pinging every time creatures come in, or if you want to attack with them later and you could put counters on them or just buff their power somehow. I love the fact that this gives you options.
Yeah, let's go to more discard outlets. Smuggler's Copter. You crew it, you attack with it every turn, and it gives you a draw and a discard. It's a 2 mana investment, same as Thrill Possibility. possibility, but you get to keep doing it. It's also an artifact. If you're playing an artifacts deck, this goes perfectly with your deck. It goes with your deck more than an instant would.
Plus, it just has flying. It has evasion, right? So, and you get it whether you attack or block. So if someone's trying to swing at you with a little Thopter or something, like, no, actually, I'll draw a card off of that, and I'll also block that.
Yeah, super perfect. Also, Matsalantli, the Great Door, it has 1,000 words. Basically, what you can just use it as is a 3-mana artifact that taps to draw and discard every turn. You can use it right away, so you get that first thing no matter what happens to this later, and it just sticks around. And sure, later in the game, maybe it becomes a threat. Maybe you get to do that, but we don't care. We can just use it as a repeatable draw and discard outlet. We can trigger our Madness stuff, same as Thrill. It's actually less mana investment the turns after, because Thrill is a 2-mana investment up front, and this is just set it and forget it.
I think that this has a lot of potential, especially since this is, as you mentioned, set and forget. So I think if people forget about it, it can flip into the land later, and you could be having a lot of mana for very little investment. The next card is a removal spell that I'm very surprised to see in so many decks. It's Krosan Grip, 9% of decks, or 174,000. 2-degree for an instant with Split Second, which says, as long as the spell is on the stack, players can't cast spells or activate abilities that are not mana abilities. And it just says, destroy target artifact or enchantment.
First, I want to mention Moxfield.com, because that's where the ad is, and you got bamboozled. If you thought you could guess where this is, like Mia said in the beginning, you're a liar. Moxfield's great. They got brand new features. You can check them out. You can enter your color identity. If you're a content creator like us, you can tag yourself, and you can get all the links to your socials, no matter if you're making content or not.
And if you want to look at somebody's profile, you can actually search in the search bar and see all of the decks that come up with that name, whether that's BZ's Balmor deck or my Uro deck. You can type it in, and it'll come up instantly.
All right, back to Krosan Grip, because I know everybody was excited when we mentioned Krosan Grip again. It's been a hot minute since we came after Krosan Grip. But we want to talk about why it's actually played. Split Second, the ability itself, makes Krosan Grip feel safer, makes players feel safer when they do it, and the card is very splashy and very loud when it works. When you hit something that they wanted to use but couldn't use because of Split Second, that's a big event at the table, and it's definitely something you remember.
But one of the problems is, how fast is Split Second, or how does Split Second work? I didn't remember what was on our light board. Split Second is not relevant enough to justify overpaying for this spell, because there are a lot of destroy target artifact or enchantment for less than 3 mana, but they don't have the Split Second tacked on. So the question is, how relevant is that for you? We've polled people, and they've said it's relevant about 10% of the time, but you're still paying 100% of the time that 3 mana. So how relevant is it to you that it's in your deck?
Right, like we polled people who played Krosan Grip, and they said, yeah, like you said, about 10%. But if you could save 1 mana, 33% of the mana, 100% of the time, isn't that just more worth it? To me, it definitely is. But I think another thing about Krosan Grip's a weird card. Split Second is not a card, an ability that sees commander play at all. So I wanted to clear up some common misconceptions and just about how the rules work. We've had people mention this in recent comments on the polls or other things, and I just want to clear this up, because some people will say, like, if they're comboing off and doing things with Ashnod's Altar, this is great because Krosan Grip can just kill it and then they can't respond. It's actually not true with Phyrexian Altar and Ashnod's Altar and Krark-Clan Ironworks, because those are mana abilities. So if they've got some kind of loop, they can go off with that, or at least if you target their Ashnod's Altar, they can sack whatever they want first, still underneath your Split Second. Also, Aetherflux Reservoir is a very common card that people like to kill with Krosan Grip and say, ha, you couldn't do anything. The thing about Aetherflux Reservoir, especially if you're somebody who plays against Krosan Grip, if I'm at, let's say, 70 life, and then I cast Aetherflux Reservoir, opponent's pass priority, Aetherflux Reservoir resolves. I have priority, so players can't cast spells because I need to do something first. I can pay 50 life, target someone, and now Krosan Grip is too slow for that, because there's no card that's fast enough. Krosan Grip can't stop me from playing a spell and then activating it with priority still on me, and to deal 50 damage. Krosan Grip will resolve before the 50 damage goes through, but you can't remove that from the stack. It doesn't happen every time. A lot of times what happens is they'll play Aetherflux, pass, then if you Krosan Grip it, they cannot respond. But if you know about it, this meta gets real silly real fast, and I just go, all right, let's pay, zap you. It's like, oops.
Especially if you are nuking the person who had the Krosan Grip. It's like, I almost had you. It's like, you didn't have priority, though. And there's a common misconception that Split Second locks down the entire stack. So if someone casts Krosan Grip like on top of it, it's like, you can't respond to anything on the stack, which is not true either, because you can let Krosan Grip resolve, because you can't respond to the Krosan Grip itself. But if Krosan Grip resolves, you can still respond to anything underneath it with those spells. It doesn't lock down everything on the stack.
Right. If there's a Beast Within and a counter spell on the stack, and then someone throws a Krosan Grip on top of that, you don't have to let all 3 of those resolve. You just have to let the Krosan Grip resolve. Now it's first in, last out, goes away. The counterspell's back on the stack on the top of it, and you can still do stuff now. So that's just some misconceptions we wanted to clear up. But mainly, we're here because I would rather pay less mana for a spell that doesn't have split second, because I don't think split second is that relevant. So the number one alternative, we're going to go over this quick because it's amazing. It's Nature's Claim. You save 2 mana every time compared. I do think people are playing these cards alongside each other, but I do want to mention that's like the GOAT, basically, for instant speed naturalize.
I mean, it feels so good being able to snipe some Soul Ring turn 1 with this, and you can't do that with Krosan Grip.
Nope.
The next one is Sundering Vitae. This is Convoke. It's 3 mana, but it really never will be. And it's destroy target enchantment or artifact, and it'll usually be free or at least a very heavily discounted because you're in green. You're going to be making a bunch of little guys to be tapping and just using it for free instead.
The one thing Krosan Grip is honestly terrible at is taking out problematic things early in the game. You don't want to spend your turn 3 when you're trying to develop to blow something up. But with Sundering Vitae, you can easily develop your board. If you get 3 creatures out by turn 3 or 4 or whatever, you cast this for free, and now you're stifling them while not wrecking your own game plan, which I think is something Krosan Grip just can't do. It's not a question whether do I want to waste my turn 3 or blow up like an Arcane Signet or something that's important to their game plan. But I can easily do that when I hold up a Sundering Vitae. We also have Collective Resistance. It can escalate. Its baseline is naturalized, so you can either choose an artifact or enchantment to destroy for 2 mana. But if you pay more on top of it, you can also hit both. So now we're hitting 2 things for 3 mana, which is Krosan Grip's rate. Or I can also give a creature hexproof and indestructible until end of turn.
Escalate is the modal ability that we love to see, and if you have a little bit more mana, it's great to have that. But overall, being able to snipe multiple targets if you do have the mana, and if not, just having it for cheaper, we love that. Next is Wilt too. I mean, it's just a 2 mana destroyed artifact or enchantment, but you could cycle it for 2 also, so it's never dead in your hand.
Yeah, I genuinely do think this card is better than Krosan Grip. I think being able to save the mana and being able to cycle the card when it's not relevant is so much of a huge jump over Krosan Grip. I think the other thing too about Krosan Grip is it's not a card that can take out things early, and it's not a card that can be really cast, alongside a bunch of other spells in a turn. And I think what happens if you trend more towards the Krosan Grip side of removal is you're going to run into these situations where players are assembling all of these pieces and they're getting things, and you think, wow, split second is really great. But it's like, you know what would have also stopped their combo? Just blowing up one of their pieces like 2 turns ago if you had the mana.
I think players who play Krosan Grip are usually, if they see these other types of removal at the table, they're getting a little bit outpaced. It's just a little bit too slow a lot of the time. So being able to replace it with more mana efficient spells can overall help their win percentage.
Yeah, it's a hard card to quit because when it works, you're gonna
feel good.
You're never gonna forget, and when it's stuck in your hand, you probably don't notice as much. But let's go to the next card. It's Return to Dust, another artifact enchantment removal card. 5% of decks, 92,000. It's 2 white for an instant, or is it? Because it exiles target artifact or enchantment. But if you cast a spell during your main phase, you can exile up to 1 other target artifact or enchantment. Why is this played? It's a 2-for-1 removal spell. It exiles instead of destroys, which is a nice little bonus. We are paying for it. It's 4 mana, but instant speed. I don't know if this card is an instant speed card. When kind of like, I don't know. You're really incentivized to play this as a sorcery. I don't know if I've ever really seen this as an instant.
I mean, it's technically instant speed if you really need it to be, but not usually. And I know we promote a lot of the 2-for-1 removal spells because that's the best way to do it. Why would you pay this much mana to remove one thing when you can remove multiple things? But this is a sorcery 90% of the time because of that 2-for-1 clause that you're probably playing it for. And if you're paying it at instant speed, 4 mana is a terrible rate to be doing that.
Yeah, so I think either way, we can probably upgrade it, re-examine this card. And I think all these other options are great as well. Crush Contraband, it's 3 and a white instant. You exile an artifact, and you can exile an enchantment. So we've kept the 4 mana, we kept the instant, and assuming you don't want to hit exactly artifact, or enchantment, it's just straight up better. It's still even exiles instead of destroying.
Heliod's Intervention is also amazing in this type of decks because you can either gain a bunch of life depending on what you pay into X, or destroy X target enchantments or artifacts. And I like the fact that it's very modal, and if you need to like snipe 1 or 2 things, you have the option. But if it's just sitting in your hand and you have a bunch of mana untapped because you don't really know what to do with your turn, you could gain a bunch of life too.
Yeah, this has the same baseline rate. I can pay 4 mana at instant speed to destroy 2 things. So we're losing exile, but we're gaining the ability at instant speed to destroy 2 things. And it scales with however much mana you have. We also have, if we're going to go the sorcery route, since that's kind of when we're casting Return to Dust anyway, just play Dismantling Wave. For each opponent, you get to naturalize something, and it costs 1 less, and it even has a big big mode, 8 mana cycle, destroy everything.
I don't think you'll be using that too often, but if you do, it's nice to have stapled on. Plus Requisition Raid, this is from Outlaws, so if you missed that entire thing, this is the really good spree mechanic because it's even though it's sorcery speed, which you'll mostly be playing Return to Dust at anyways, it's cheaper, you have spree, and you can put 1/1 counters on your team too, depending on how much mana you're paying into the spell.
Yeah, I think at sorcery speed, all of these cards that we just mentioned totally blow Return to Dust out of the water, and at instant speed, Return to Dust isn't that effective. So I definitely think those are really good upgrades. We're going to go to another blue card, and we have Aetherize. 5% of blue decks, 108,000 decks to be exact. 3 to blue instant, return all attacking creatures to their owner's hand.
I feel like so many people play this because it's the gotcha card, right? You did all of your damage and, oh, at the end step, because your creatures were attacking, let's bring them all back to your hand, and now you don't have a board. And I feel like there's a rush in casting a gotcha card, right? It's just like you feel that joy of having it. And I feel like there aren't a lot of cards to replace that, and if you do want to play that because of that feeling, go for it.
Yeah, I think that is a very real reason people play this card, and I can't try to replace a feeling that a card brings, so please play that. We have no problems with that at all. People do play this because of a potential for a blowout. I think that potential is very real. Don't get me wrong. And it can also answer any number of creatures without scaling the mana you pay. It's not like if 50 creatures are attacking you, you have to pay more for this. It's still only 4. So if you're under some kind of humongous pressure, this can still bail you out. And I think there are some cards that can't do that. So that's definitely a plus for people when putting Aetherize in their decks. We do have some problems with it, though. I do think it's very specific. It only answers attacking creatures. If there's any creature that's getting you down, any creature that's a problem, if they're just leaving it back, then you kind of can't touch it with this card.
I feel like with a lot of the value pieces that you want to be removing, they're going to be holding it back to begin with. So Aetherize is usually not the greatest to remove those anyways, unless it's one of the big green stompy things that's coming at you. Also, 4 mana is just a lot to hold up if you think they're going to attack you or attack something else, or just have a creature attacking that you want removed off the board. 4 mana, that could be multiple counter spells. That could be just something way bigger and more proactively better.
Right. It's true that you can hold up both at the same time if you have them both in your hand, but I think once you start holding up 4 or more mana, me as the attacker, my eyebrows are raised. You know, if you have an Infernal Grasp and you're holding up 2 mana, or you tapped out and you have a Snuff Out, I have no idea. I'm not going to really think too much about that. But if you're like, draw, go, I'm like, okay, what's up? Maybe I need to just think about what could happen here. So I think that's definitely a downside of the card. It can also never be used proactively on an opposing creature. If you want a creature off the board, you just have to wait. At least with Aetherize, it doesn't give you any sort of versatility. It can only be used in this one scenario.
And it's just waiting and relying on your opponents to do the attack that you want is really disappointing. I'm going to compare this to Inkshield real quick, because it's like if they only attack you with 1 or 2 little creatures, like a bunch of like 2/2 tokens, like a couple 2/2 tokens, are you going to be using Aetherize on it? Probably not. And the same with like Inkshield. If they attack you with like 4 damage, are you going to be spending 5 mana for that? Probably not. So it's just like if they're not aiming them the right way, then that's a lot of mana to keep up for a maybe.
I think as a general rule of thumb, waiting around for your opponents to make the decision that you want them to make will often leave you just disappointed. So let's get to some alternatives. We'd rather play Mystic Confluence instead. This is a 5 mana thing. You can choose the same mode, blah, blah, blah. Draw a card, counter spell unless they pay 3, or bounce a creature. So this can still get you out of some potentially problematic attacks. If there's one creature buffing everything, there's like a Jetmir attack, right? You can totally blank it, get it out of here, nerf everything else. Definitely this is a card that can let you survive very big attacks from very large creatures. I think definitely there's a big overlap in what this will save you from versus what Aetherize, because a lot of times there's a big thing or there's a pump creature in play, and it doesn't have to be attacking. This can be used in any number of ways, offensively, defensively, fire it off on the end step to draw 3. It's perfect.
I love the fact that it's like, okay, if you want to counter something and you bounce something and you draw a card all for 5 mana, I feel like I could do anything with this card.
It really is. It's a card that you can hold up and never be disappointed.
The next card is Perplexing Test. This bounces either all tokens or all non-token creatures, and you have the option to pick. So if you are a blue deck that is very heavy on tokens, for instance, if you're like a Talrand deck, this can be really great in there to bounce all the non-tokens and keep your entire army and make sure everyone else's is gone.
And this will have the exact same effect as Aetherize does a significant portion of the time, because there's a lot of attacks that are like, oh, 1 billion Scoot Swarms. I have 100 tokens. I cast Call the Coppercoats on your end step, and now I'm attacking you with a bajillion. It's like, okay, cool. This will still bail me out of all of that stuff, but I can use it as basically a board reset, because generally speaking, most of the creatures in play are non-token creatures. And it's just, I think, more useful. It's not a card you have to wait around or cross your fingers with. We also have Turnabout. I think Turnabout is an interesting split between only a blowout card or only a card I'm going to use for myself. This can tap somebody's creatures. If you know there's a big lethal swing that you're dead to, you can tap their stuff. But most of the time, this actually is just for you to untap your lands to basically treat it like a ritual.
I love this card, actually. I have this in Zavai, and it's a really good card in there because 95% of the time, I am untapping all my lands and effectively taking an extra turn. But in the very small percent of chance that I need to tap something else, then I have the option to, and it feels good.
Yeah, it can still give you that blank a combat step blowout, and I think it could still be a whoa, like what just happened moment for that person.
But it's more proactive.
Right, and for you. And I think in general, the exact effect of Aetherize is not really something we're looking to replicate. I think we prefer the cards that we have listed here. Okay, next up, one of the most played black cards. I know people are just going to hate me for this one, but we're going to go to Village Rites. It's in 10% of all black decks, 220,000. It is black for an instant. As an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a creature, draw 2 cards. Now, I want to reiterate here that we're not saying these cards are terrible and they should never see play ever, but I do think they are overplayed. I think 10%, it's a fair bit higher than I think where I would rank the card. So we're going to talk about why it's played like usual. It's cheap card draw. This is a cheap way to cash something hopefully useless in to draw cards. It's also a one-time sacrifice outlet.
It's just you can get those death triggers if you really need. And there are a lot of black decks that just rely on the death triggers and also just need a little bit of card draw. So it feels good. And it's also just feels good to resolve because you're just, okay, you're using 1 card, 1 mana, 1 creature, and you draw 2. That feels like a bargain in practice, but in theory, maybe not so much.
And I will give this credit where credit is due. In the late game, this thing cycles for free very, very easily. When you draw a Village Rites on turn 8, you're like, oh, cool, great, more cards. And you just pay a mana and you sack whatever, and you're like, cool, we're off to the races. That's good. So I will definitely will give it credit there. I think there's some problems, though, when I'm looking at card draw and what one of the benefits to card draw is, especially cheap card draw. The setup cost is higher than it seems. You can't just play this to draw 2 cards every single time. Sometimes you have to sacrifice a creature that you really need, because I think one of the biggest utilities for card draw early is to help hit your land drops, help hit you the things that you need to hit to continue like building out your board in the early game. It's great on turn 8 when you have got all your stuff going, but it doesn't really help you set up at all.
Yeah, I feel like you just need a lot of moving pieces for this card. Another thing is that the card type can be awkward. I mean, it's a one-time use thing, but you also need disposable creatures, and sometimes they just don't always mesh in the right deck. I know that it works pretty well in Edgar and stuff. I've had really good success with that type of thing, but that's only because I'm casting stuff and getting free stuff that I can sacrifice immediately, and a lot of decks just don't do that. Usually you need more effort into getting creatures onto the board.
To put it this way, I don't think 10% of all black decks, which is what this sees plays in, can produce enough creatures quickly enough for fodder that I feel safe with this card developing in the early turns, or I feel like it justifies, it'll help me hit a land drop, it'll help me get out of a situation and not just be a brick for the first like 3 turns of the game. Because I think there's other cards, the cards that we're listing, they aren't necessarily bricks all the time.
It's crazy to think that Village Rites is actually a late game card despite it being 1 mana, but in theory it might be because it needs more setup. But some of the alternatives is Deadly Dispute. It's a little bit more mana, but you can sacrifice a creature or an artifact to draw 2 and create a treasure, so it kind of refunds itself immediately.
Yeah, so this doesn't really get around the problem of what am I supposed to do with this early? However, I do think this is just a better version of Village Rites in almost every way, because since you're not casting it for the first 3 turns, the extra mana you pay in is automatically paid back to you in a way that makes you even happier because you could potentially store it. So I think it's just better in every way. It can sack more things. It gives you more stuff, more resources to fiddle around with. So that's just something to note. There's also Plumb the Forbidden. I love Plumb the Forbidden. Plumb the Forbidden scales with the number of creatures you have. You can sacrifice 8 creatures to draw 9 cards if you want. But I think somewhat crucially, you can just play this for 2 mana to draw a card. And that's definitely something I've done that I've been thankful to have in the early game when there's something going wrong.
I love Plumb the Forbidden. It's just I love making a bunch of punchy little guys, and this is a great way to use them for card draw overall.
I think it's really, really good. I've had much more success with it. I've felt a lot better with it. So there's also, we're going to get to the next issue that we might be able to solve. I think that type issue is definitely one I'm considering, because if I'm in a super heavy 50 creature deck, do I really want to play Village Rites when I could be playing a creature instead? I think you might be able to get your card draw from a Grim Haruspex or a Midnight Reaper in a more effective way. And I know people are going to be like, yeah, they're way more expensive to cast. Kind of. But in the early game, we're still casting Grim Haruspex and Midnight Reaper before we're casting Village Rites. So I don't think it's that much different. Even though the mana cost says this, I think they are comparable. And I think you might be better off if you have a 50 creature deck with just playing either one of these cards.
It's not even that much more expensive because you're going to need the creature to sacrifice anyways, and you're probably paying mana for that creature, or you're paying mana for a creature that comes in with it, you know? In a perfect world, and not like Edgar, for instance, you have like Jadar, turn 2, he makes a dude, you have to use Village Rites, so that's 3 mana anyways. It's not like that much more of a rate.
It's really not that crazy. All right, our next card, this is a big one. Get ready, because we got Cultivate. It is in, I did not know this, 47% or 937,000 decks. That's half. That's basically half of all green decks have this card, and I do think it's overplayed a little bit. It's not a card I would say belongs at 0, but it's not a card I would put at 50. So we have 2 in a green sorcery, search your library for 2 basic lands, reveal those cards, put one into the battlefield tapped, and the other one into your hand. Why is this played? First and foremost, it's ramp. We know ramp is good. Ramp is not a bad thing in Commander. We are happy to have it. It puts more lands in play ahead of schedule.
And it also puts one into your hand, whether you need colors or you just are worried about your land count and you want to go find it. It's another reason to play it, and it helps you not miss them in the future.
Yeah, when it puts an extra land in your hand, you kind of know that you have a guaranteed land drop for next turn. Sometimes when you ramp spell and you miss a land, kind of feel like you wasted your time a little bit because you're like, well, I ramped, but I missed my land drop, so it's not great. So it does fix that problem. But I think there are also other problems that arise with Cultivate that just make it not a card I ever really want to go to. For most green decks, it offers 0 synergy. I don't think this comes as a surprise or is very controversial at all. It's a sorcery. Green decks tend to care about creatures or even to a lesser extent like enchantments or artifacts before they care about sorceries. So you're going to cast it once, it'll do its thing, and then it as a card will never matter again.
It's also just pretty slow in general. There are things like Nature's Lore and stuff like that where it will come in untapped, but this will always come in tapped, and then it'll bring one to your hand that you can't play until next turn for the most part, or at least if you're casting on turn 3.
Just in general, I think ramp that starts at turn 3, I'm not super stoked about it. There are a slew of 2 mana ones that I think feel better and help you curve out in a more meaningful way. I hesitate when the ramp starts to get past, definitely when it gets past 3, it starts to feel a little clunky, but it's slower compared to some of the other stuff. You do get that benefit and the safety of having a land in your hand, but you are paying for it. It's 3 mana when most of the other stuff is 2 mana. I think when you curve out and you don't need that land drop, Cultivate can feel pretty bad if you've got a glut of lands in your hands. And I also think the other thing about it is ramp. Ramp tends to be fixing, but it's not good fixing if you're 4 or 5 colors. So Cultivate's definitely a card I want to stay away from in a 4 and 5 color decks, just full stop.
I love playing 4 and 5 colors, but if you're finding basics in your 4 and 5 colors, you're not always getting the pips or colors you need unless you are heavily into one color in that 4 or 5 color deck. And if that's the case, still, why are you playing Cultivate? I don't know.
Even if you go Forest, Plains, Swamp, and then you Cultivate for Mountain Island, you've got Wooburg, but I don't think that's a good start for a 5 color deck. You might be on some kind of hyper budget or something, and maybe, but I still think even on that case, I think you could do better. I just think that's not a good setup for a 5 color deck.
I don't think so either. I feel like when I play my 4 and 5 color decks, there are so many instances where I need multiple pips or something, or I'm leaning more heavily towards one color, and if I need to set up with all 5 colors, I don't have access to those multiple pips or spells that have colors in them that I need. I just feel like my time is a little bit wasted at that point.
Right, so we're not gunning for Cultivate here when we offer suggestions. We're not gunning for it full stop, but I'm going to throw ifs, and if that is you, then I would highly recommend what I'm about to list instead of Cultivate. So if you're a creature deck, I want cards that are going to be relevant more than once, cards I can recur, cards that cost less if I have something, cards that make other things cost less, cards that trigger when I cast a creature spell or a creature spell payoff. So we're talking about Sakura Tribuilder, Wood Elves, Elvish Rejuvenator, the new frog from Bloomborough even. These are cards that are relevant more than once, very often, whether you're flickering, reanimating, recurring, pumping, attacking, whatever. I think these cards, they don't give you the extra land in hand, but they are either cheaper or give you another resource that is just as valuable, if not more so, than a land.
It will just play better into your deck strategy. But if you're a land deck, there are other ways to do it than with Cultivate. One of them is Springbloom Druid, because you can sack a land, maybe it matters if it's in your graveyard, and you can find 2 that can matter for your landfall triggers. Or a Harrow, same thing, but it's just a little bit faster, and you can find better lands.
I think for landfall decks specifically, getting a land into your hand is nice. It's nice to have another one that maybe you can play right away or whatever. But I think putting a land in the graveyard is also very valuable, and triggering landfall twice instead of once is also very valuable. And I think those 2 things add up to more than what Cultivate can offer, even for a land-specific like a Splendid Reclamation deck or a Landfall with like Scoot Swarm deck. And then if you're looking for speed, if you're just trying to ramp out quick, if you've got like an Atali deck or a Maelstrom Wanderer deck where your goal is just get this thing out as fast as possible, then I would say cut all your 3-mana ramp like that only can ramp you once at a time, and go for Nature's Lore, 3 visits, and even Sky Shroud Claim, because that does cost 4 upfront, but it gets 2 things and they enter untapped, and they can be non-basics.
I've touched upon this a little bit earlier in the video, but it feels so good to have that untapped forest come in. I have had really good turns where it's like the Nature's Lore, the land comes in untapped, and then I play a Llanowar Elves or something, and I am way farther ahead than I would have been earlier.
Yeah, I think Llanowar Elves and Utopia Sprawl are like another thing that's like secretly competing with Cultivate that we can't delve a ton into this video because we're kind of offering like 1-for-1 replacements, but that is another thing to consider in addition. So let's get to the next card. I want to let you do this one.
This is Reliquary Tower. This is a colorless land that's in 29% of decks in general, which is 1,225,000. That is so many. I don't think 29% of decks overall should be playing this. It just says you have no max hand size and you can tap it to add colorless. It can essentially help you save cards if you have enough card draw to make it where you would have to discard in general. And it can also be used with wheel decks, which is where I like to use it, because it can help your opponents draw and like discard more, or it can help you keep them if you have something that says like this is like has the stats of the amount of cards in your hand. That can help you.
Yeah, definitely. There are definitely positives to use this card. Like you said, it keeps, like, let's say I have 8 cards in my hand. What Reliquary Tower actually does when I go to my end step and I don't discard is it keeps my worst card into my hand. It keeps my 8th card in my hand. That's what it does, and that is definitely valuable for some decks. And if you want to stack up your hand size so that you can punish other players for it, totally also valid. And Omniscience. If you build up all the extra worst cards in your hand instead of discarding them, that can be relevant with Omniscience because you're just like spewing everything out, and it's relevant to have anything extra to close the door on the game. And it also has a low opportunity cost. This is, I think, the biggest one. I know lands swapping into your deck have low opportunity costs, but I think Reliquary Tower is an interesting one because the effect it has on the game tends to be, in an average deck, if you just threw this into a random deck, very low, what it will actually do for you. So I don't think this argument works as well because now there's also a low opportunity cost to replace Reliquary Tower with one of the other lands that we're about to list. So let's just get into the problems because that was the plus side. I think it's pretty hard to get a tangible benefit from this. I did just mention this, but yeah, keeping your 8th best card, how good is that for you? I think most of the time it's very negligible.
I also feel like a lot of Commander players don't play enough card draw to get the point where you need this incredibly consistently. Sure, there are decks that need it, like the Nekuzar decks, or decks where you're really caring about like the Omniscience, for instance. But in the average deck, I would not say 1 in 4 decks consistently have a problem where they need to keep their 8th card, and this is in more than 1 in 4 decks.
Right, exactly. And we're ignoring the Nekuzar. Well, like I think that's totally fair. I think Reliquary Tower has plenty of homes. But we're approaching 1 in 3 decks have this, and I don't even think 1 in 10 decks need this. I think that's where we're at. Any deck relying on the graveyard for any reason probably actually doesn't want Reliquary Tower. It might actually make your deck worse in some cases. If you want to be able to put certain creatures in the graveyard to reanimate, or you want to have a full graveyard for a living death or whatever, you don't want Reliquary Tower. You actually would love the ability, when you draw enough cards, to discard big creatures or discard things that you don't need right now but can get back later, and they're almost trapped in your hand in some cases when you do this.
I don't want to see anybody playing Looters and Reliquary Tower in the same thing because you want to be able to discard cards as often as you would like.
Lastly, we need to put ourselves into the game, into a situation where we have 7 cards in hand. We're probably either looking to press our advantage or we're looking to recover because something bad happened to us. And note, we have 7 cards in hand, or we have more with Reliquary Tower. I don't think rebuilding or pressing your advantage is that difficult when you have 7 cards in your hand. So if you're just trying to throw Reliquary Tower into a random deck, I don't think it's going to help you much more than that, because I think maybe the trick with Reliquary Tower is when you have 8 cards in your hand instead of 7, it feels like you drew a card. But you're not keeping anything but your worst card. If you had to discard, you would discard your worst card. How much effort do you want to put into, you know, not playing another dual land or not playing a better utility land because you want to keep your 8th card, which generally is not going to, you know, swing the game one way or the other when you already have 7.
Also, just in general, this does remove pips from your mana base.
It could.
And there is just the option of, I feel like so many commanders are 3, 4, and 5 colors, it might hinder you just to be able to cast your spells, especially if you include too many of these utility lands. And yes, the opportunity cost is very low, but not if you can't cast your spells in the long run.
Right. So we're going to talk about some lands that are colorless. They're the utility land type, because you can replace it with a dual land, but I can't request, you know, I'm not going to tell you that what dual lands there are. There are plenty to choose from. But I think, man, I would say 1 in 5 people who, how about this? 4 out of 5 people who play Reliquary Tower, I would challenge you to replace it with one of these cards. If you're not doing the Omniscience, the Nekusar, the Windfall type of thing, I would challenge you to just replace it with basically any one of these cards chosen at random, because I've been very happy with all of them. The first one is War Room. If your deck is 1 or 2 colors, which is the decks that can play the most colorless lands, that's great. You can cash this in, or cash in mana for cards, and it'll help you get back to 7 or get back to a place where you started out in a tough spot, but this can get you out of it instead of just saying, I have a abundance of riches, I'm slightly happier.
Honestly, I've played this in 3 color decks where I can actually gain the life back a little bit. It's worth it in the card draw in the land slot. I think that's very, very important. Another way to get that card draw in the land slot is Fountain Port. This is a new one from Bloomborough. Basically, you can cash in tokens for cards, or make tokens, or make treasures, or tap it, and it comes in untapped for colorless mana. I love the fact that this does a little bit of everything, and if you need a mana sink, you know where to put it.
Yeah, I think if you activate this once, it generally has already done more than Reliquary Tower will in a game. There's also Urza's Cave. This card is, I don't know if it's not getting enough hype, but I think it's pretty cracked. It just finds your best land. If you have any land that is not utility, or any land, even like a Bajuka Bog or a Cabal Coffer or something like that has impact on the game, this card is amazing, and it will do a ton for you. Definitely more than a Reliquary Tower, I think.
I have to put this in more decks. This is a very good card. Finding your best land is incredibly powerful. And there's also Demolition Field. Land destruction is also incredibly powerful. There are so many times where I wish I had something to destroy, like Beezy's Nykthos, for instance, or Field of the Dead, and this can really help you come in handy.
This is one of the cards that's just creeping up into the rankings where I'm playing it in almost every 1 and 2 color deck. It's so great to have that removal utility stapled on. And once again, if we're talking Reliquary Tower, I think Demolition Field is like much, much more playable and will give you much, much more mileage. If you're looking for more mileage out of your Magic cards, there's more Nitpicking nerds. Don't worry. How about right here?